We just began the month of October. The rollout of the Warsaw International Film Festival began this week. We have New York Film Festival, which is coming to an end, and AFI is just about to begin. This is Eric from IndieSponge with Kevin Jagernauth. Kevin, this week we saw the birth of a new distribution label, but that dates back to the 50s. So a little black and white has been spruced up and in living color, and we have a new title that will be launched in January. So what are MGM folks up to?
So MGM is reviving their American International Pictures label. And for those of us who crawl through B movies, will recognize it from a lot of the films that sort of Quentin Tarantino and Robert Rodriguez, that they champion, that inspired their sort of grindhouse fare. So, I mean, we're talking movies like Foxy Brown and Coffee and Amityville Horror, but also films like Martin Scorsese's Boxcar Bertha and George Miller's Mad Max. So there's been some notable filmmakers who have gone through the label over the years, and now MGM has revived it, and their first release under this banner will be Breaking News in Yuba County.
Essentially, it's a January 29th release. I like the fact that you mentioned all these filmmakers. Tate Taylor does not fit in this category, so perhaps it's something to do about the DNA of this film. I believe it was a blacklist item a couple of years back. We have Jake Gyllenhaal's production company behind this. We have an eclectic cast, female-centric cast, with Allison Janney top-lining this. We have Mila Kunis, Regina Hall, and Awkwafina, and a larger ensemble. So essentially, for them to revamp this label, they're going with something that somewhat doesn't feel as if it's an extension of the past. So what does it say about MGM that they revamped the Orion Classics division in 2018? Are they essentially going to try to fit some of the purchases that they make or items that they have in the pipeline? Are they going to be very selective and more into curation? Is the idea? Is that the idea?
I think that's the $1 million question. I mean, we know that MGM, the mainline studio, their big release coming up is the constantly pushed back James Bond film. But it'll be interesting. I think we're in an era now where we see labels like A24 and Neon really staking out a claim with strong branding, with strong curation, as you mentioned. So it'll be interesting to see if MGM takes that approach, if they use Orion and AIP to, maybe make acquisitions at festivals and release smaller films in these little outlets and leave the mainline MGM for their blockbusters. As for Yuba County, it's a genre film. It's about a woman who catches her husband sleeping with someone else. And he's so shocked, he actually has a heart attack and dies, and then she buries the body. So it sounds kind of Coen-esque. It sounds like the kind of movie we might have seen on American International Pictures in the 70s, perhaps. Sort of a capery crime kind of film. But yeah, now that MGM has these two labels, it'll be interesting to see how they differentiate them and how they use them to release films. I think it'll be interesting to see that evolve. Because as you mentioned, Orion's back, and a couple of those films, they put their Child's Play reboot on Orion and Bill and Ted's. So to me, I don't see why those would be on Orion and not AIP, unless AIP is strictly for films that don't belong to a franchise. I don't know. So yeah, it'll be interesting to see. I think it'll be interesting to see how this plays out.
Definitely, and IndieWire brought across a point that that they were sort of competing with Blumhouse, and Blumhouse, we know it as strictly horror productions that go up to 30 million. So perhaps it's a way for MGM to sort of like better categorize their future output. But it'll be curious to see how they pad the 2021 calendar with further titles, whether it's in their wheelhouse or acquisitions, as is the case here. Amazon is teaming up with Reed Morano and Charlie Kaufman on a book adaptation. Reed Morano is in a really interesting spot right now. She's attached to about a half dozen projects. And this project is something that Charlie Kaufman had mentioned when he was doing the press rounds for his book Antkind. And I was under the impression that that was probably going to be his next directorial outing. But my question to you is Reed Morano a good fit for what essentially feels like a Fahrenheit 451, something that's dystopian like. As we know, she's done texts. I think We're Alone Now and The Handmaid's Tale with her, which are both belong to very specific worlds. What do you think about this triangle of Kaufman, this piece of Japanese literature, and Reed Morano?
So I've read the book, and I saw some of the news reports this week, and everyone is I think it's a lot of people haven't read the book, or who are at least writing about the film. And my initial reaction a few months ago was that I thought Charlie Kaufman was actually the wrong fit for the book. It touches on similar themes. It's basically set. I wouldn't even necessarily call it. It's a semi-dystopian world where you wake up one day and, let's say, an everyday object like a hairbrush. It'll be the memory police will have decided that collectively hairbrushes are verboten, and not only do they all completely disappear, people start forgetting about what a hairbrush is, what it does. So that item is erased from their memories. So the book itself is actually very, very grounded. It's not like Handmaid's Tale kind of dystopia. It's not Eternal Sunshine kind of surreal mania. It's really a very grounded personal story about a woman who's alone, and she's actually one of the few people who's able to remember things that disappear. And eventually she's a novelist, and she works with her book editor, and they come together as these events develop, and they become under scrutiny of the memory police. But it's really a very grounded story about the things in our lives that are important to us. So I kind of like that Reed Morano's directing it, because I think Charlie Kaufman tends to spin out into like more intellectual territory or into more surreal territory, where I think this needs something with a greater personal touch, because it's similar thematically, but in terms of style and aesthetic, it is very different.
Yeah, I'm thinking a lot about Reed Morano. Of course, we know her as a cinematographer, and she made her way into directing with a film with Olivia Wilde, and obviously The Handmaid's Tale was a major breakout for her. And I quite like certain elements, stylistic element, and choices that she makes in I Think We're Alone Now. I think specifically, I'm trying to imagine how the memory police might look like or sound like or feel like. I feel as if it's going to be something with a lot of textures, and especially if we're thinking of like separate objects and how we relate to something that's no longer there and how it is in memory. And I think Reed's work, especially in film, might do this film some good.
I think you're right. I think, that's the thing. I should also mention that in the novel itself, I mean, I don't know how the script plays out. There's actually not that many main characters. It's a very intimate story that essentially trades between a small handful of characters. So I think Reed Morano is a good choice, and you're right. Aesthetically, I think she will bring a lot to it because it really needs. It's a film that's going to say a lot, I think, um, through visuals and through tone, and I think she will have the right touch to sort of bring it to life. And I'm actually curious where they'll set it. I mean, this is a Japanese novel, so obviously it was set in that kind of setting. I'm curious if they'll how they will make that adaptation and what the characters are like and what the settings like.
Yeah, perhaps they'll go for an Inaratu world, like a Babel or something that physically feels like a lot of places at the same time. This week, it's been reported that John David Washington is going to replace Michael B. Jordan in a project that also includes Christian Bale and Margot Robbie. We don't have a lot to go on. We have a very small log line.
Yeah, so there was a time when David O. Russell was just making film after film. I mean, his run from essentially The Fighter through Joy, so we're talking about 4 films in 5 years. Like he was really just jumping from one to the next. And it's been 5 years now since Joy. But he has his regular collaborators. So Christian Bale's obviously one of them. Margot Robbie will be new. John David Washington obviously new to his stable. There's talk of maybe Robert De Niro, again another frequent collaborator, coming in. Yeah, I mean, all we know is that this film will possibly revolve around a doctor and a lawyer, but that could be anything. David O. Russell, he's always an interesting filmmaker to watch. I mean, his ambition is high. He loves to try new things, to push his own envelope a little bit, and he likes messy stories. So it'll be interesting. He's had a few different projects that have been half in development and that he's mentioned, like a John D. Rockefeller film. I believe he was writing something for Jennifer Lawrence, he said, last year or earlier this year. But where this fits in is interesting. And I'm curious what the look of the film might be. He's used some heavy hitter cinematographers, but yeah, will he go that road again? Will he try something new? I mean, what do you think? Where do you see him right now in his career?
That's a good question. Aside from Nailed, a project that he abandoned called Accidental Love, that was the rehash title. I feel as if, in terms of just production value, design, also working with quartet ensembles, I think it's his strong suit. You mentioned I Heart Huckabees, but I mean, well before that, I think that's one of his his strength. It's working with layered characters and working on these tight little ensembles and sort of like bringing out really great performances. I'm not a fan of Joy, but these are memorable characters, and they stay with you. I think for me, the alarm item is that he's got Chivo, and after Alfonso Cuarón, Inaratu, Malik, is this going to be a theme piece? Is this going to be over stylized? Is this going to be a sprawled out map? There's a whole bunch of questions there. What we can expect is that he's going to be courting other actors, making this much more rounded. And so there was talk that Michael Shannon might be involved and Mike Myers, which would be an interesting inclusion. But yeah, just the log line itself, the world of doctors and lawyers, perhaps there's going to be a lot of butting heads here. It's to be expected.
Yeah, as you mentioned, there's a lot of open questions, but you touched on it. I think why actors come back to work for him and why actors are attracted to his films is that he writes big, complex characters that are probably a lot of fun to play and a lot of fun to really get into. So I think for me that I don't love all of his films, but there's always he's always setting up stories that are interesting to get into and to spend time with. So it'll be interesting. I'll be looking forward to see how this develops.
So yeah, if production begins in January, this will wrap up in March, April, and there's a potential for this to be on the scorecard for perhaps December of next year. It all depends on 20th century's strategic launches and, of course, how the COVID situation goes. Another Amazon Studios project that is being put into the works, and this one's shepherded by Ted Hope, is a project called Barbarian Days, a film from a filmmaker that sort of had a great launch pad with him being the scribe for Traffic. Let's talk about this project. Let's get into the book on which the film will be adapted from, and also let's look back at this filmmaker and sort of more or less his picks and choices for the past 2 decades.
So yeah, I mean, Stephen Gaghan's made his career as a writer. Well, that's how he got noticed, with particularly with Traffic, and of course Siriano, his feature debut. He tends to gravitate towards true stories. So his 2016 film Gold was also based on a true story. Unfortunately, it wasn't the award season film people thought it would be. And then of course he directed Doolittle, which was a disaster by all accounts. So I'm actually a bit surprised to see that he's rebounded so quickly. But this film certainly plays to his strengths. It's another true story. It's another colorful character. It's about a surfer and war reporter who, the book's based on his memoir, and he had a colorful life. He went to a tough high school in Honolulu. He traveled the world, did acid, did all these crazy things. So it sounds like the kind of film that's right in his wheelhouse. It sounds like another potentially strong role for a male lead, and the sort of globe-trotting kind of adventure he loves to get his hands dirty with.
You're absolutely right on that. Siriano and Gold certainly had those elements of worldly aspects and sort of like divulging information that is normally kept from the public. I like those politicized texts. Here, the perimeters feel as if we fall into something that might be more philosophical, and it's also a project that I get a sense that it's going to span the decades, and perhaps it's going to be a look back. You named Gold, and the first thing that came to mind is I wouldn't be surprised if Matthew McConaughey somehow gets attached to this project, seeing that I've seen a couple of surfer pics of this guy. And essentially, this is a writer who had his philosophical approach includes this sport outside the sport. So yeah, I'm thinking that there's going to be a lot of backdrops, and it's going to posit in different aspects of this person's personal timeline.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. It's gonna. I mean, it's a story that spans decades, really. So it's going to touch on a lot of different moments in time, and really give, again, like an actor, whether it's McConaughey or someone else, something to really live with and feel through. So so let's hope it's Stephen Gaghan finally getting back to the place where he's comfortable, because I don't think Doolittle was the place where he was set to make the most impact.
Well, he might be a family man, and sometimes you take one for not the team, but the family. and it's certainly Doolittle perhaps meant something to him. So we'll give him a pass on that. But yeah, this project based on William Finnegan's life story could be something that we see in the distant 2022 schedule. A project that's going to begin lensing in Los Angeles in January of 21 assembles two people that have worked together on Zero Dark 30. So it's a Zero Dark 30 reunion. And it's a project that's caught my attention for a couple of reasons, namely the cast, but also the filmmaker. So losing Clementine is now has Edgar Ramírez boarding along with Jessica Chastain. I think there's a couple of things that we could say about this project. So what does this project say to you?
Foremost, I'm just glad to see Jessica Chastain kind of moving back to independent cinema.
Mm-hmm.
It's been, there was a while, she had a streak there where she was just working with, bang, one auteur after another on really interesting films. And then the past few years has just been like, the It horror movie, X-Men. She has that upcoming spy thing called 355. As we talked about earlier, the Ava, which went straight to VOD and was a really troubled production. So yeah, I mean, I would say her last like auteur movie was maybe Molly's Game in 2017, or you'd probably have to go further than that to really get into the sort of films that put her on the map. Mm-hmm. So I'm actually glad to see she's coming back and doing something smaller scale. And I think the filmmaker attached to this is interesting. I mean, I think you probably know more about this filmmaker than I do. So what do you know about I'm going to get the name wrong, Lucia Puenzo?
Lucia Puenzo, this is a catalog from Cannes back at 2007 actually, for XXY. And so she worked on what I want to say is micro cinema, at least at the onset. She is the daughter of a filmmaker, actually won the Best Foreign Picture Oscar, I believe, in the 80s. So there's a lineage there in this family. So this actually started her career. She started off at the Critics Week, and she would then go to the Berlin Film Festival in 2009 with The Fish Child. And after that, sort of like, she adhered to productions in her native tongue, perhaps Argentinian productions or Spanish co-productions. I'm not really certain, but she went more to television. She did one English language film, but here it's a clear, it's a new start for the filmmaker. And losing Clementine is I don't want to say it's a small budget. It's around the 8 to 10 million scope. But essentially, a project like this, and we'll go into the log line, Jessica Chastain portrays a bipolar protagonist who decides that she's going to commit suicide on her 36th birthday. And so what she does is it tends to close all the dossiers. And Edgar Ramírez, his character is that of the former husband. It's based on a 2012 novel. And the scribe for this actually wrote Better Call Saul. So we're going to have something that's contemporary and something that might be smaller in scope.
Yeah, and I think by the sound of it, it's going to be a real showcase for Chastain. It sounds like the kind of movie where she will be on, the focus. It's going to be I think it's going to be maybe a two-hander or a very small amount of characters, perhaps. It sounds like something that, unlike, again, like some of the franchises she's done recently, where she's just part of a larger team of people, I think this is, again, a return to something that's more intimate and will allow her to really, she's a great actress and really sort of return to those roots and do something challenging, I think.
Yeah, essentially, it's going to be a character that uncovers secrets and changes course. I haven't read the book, but I wouldn't be surprised if I do end up adding this to my read list before the feature gets released. So there's no distribution attached to this production yet. So most likely it's going to be an acquisitions friendly item, perhaps ready for TIFF. So yeah, look for that on the 2021 calendar. In Focus Features news, a filmmaker who's relatively new, named Nathalie Biancheri, made a sophomore feature this past August with a pretty cool ensemble. A project that sees George McKay in the driver's seat and Lily Rose Depp as a supporting character or co-lead. Um, and what's fun is seeing how the progression of a filmmaker in relatively short time span. So
This film is called Wolf. Um, as you might guess from the title, it's a bit of a genre piece. It's about a guy who thinks he's a wolf, not particularly in the werewolf sense, perhaps, but he thinks he's a wolf, and then has to thinks he's a wolf trapped in a human's body, and then goes for treatment uh, at the hands of a person called the zookeeper. And as you might imagine, the treatments are quite cruel and possibly unusual. It's an interesting acquisition for Focus. As you mentioned, they've really looked abroad for films. I mean, they've looked abroad for films. And lately, they've turned to genre pictures in a way they haven't really before. So they have Promising Young Woman coming up at the end of the year. They're behind Edgar Wright's Last Night in Soho. It's coming out next year. They're distributing The Northman, Robert Eggers' next film.
mhm.
And they've pivoted towards this. And one notable film to mention is they also released Julie Ducournau's Raw stateside. And I think you find perhaps some lineage between these two films a little bit.
I'm not, I want to say that it's perhaps a different label that distributed Raw.
No, they distributed it. It was Focus World, but it's part of
Okay.
that
Oh, yes, yes,
thing.
you're right.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's the first title I thought of because essentially what you're doing is if there are genre elements, this still needs to be determined, but if there are genre elements and you put in a familiar setting, um, I think that's a lot of fun. And we're going to be seeing that a lot with the monster films from Universal as well. I think what you do is you have IPs that borrow familiar type of characters, and you put it in a context where you're discussing real world problems. I think that it's an easy way to target your audience. This filmmaker, I checked out the trailer for her feature debut, which is called Nocturnal. It's a film that pretty much stayed on the other side of the pond. It's a 2019 London BFI selection, starring Cosmo Jarvis, one of my favorite breakouts of recent time, who was in Lady Macbeth and a whole bunch of cool indie titles as of late, with a Tim Sutton film and Braden King as well. Great actor. And so I looked at the trailer for that film, and obviously the title says everything that you need to know about the film. It's set in nocturnal type of environment, but I was looking at the camera work and sort of like the choices between in the fabric of the conversations between the characters in here. For this, we can expect something that's a little bit more larger. There's going to be Paddy Considine, Eileen Walsh is also there, a couple of fresh new faces as well. So it's going to be a larger canvas in terms of characters. But I think what's exciting about this filmmaker is that she's put out a lot in a very short time. And for Focus to get behind this project at this stage, where they're not even in post, I think it says a lot about them wanting to support female filmmakers. They've been attaching themselves to a lot of projects as of late. So it's a clear direction for the label, and certainly encouraging for somebody who's relatively new and really at the beginning of their film career.
Absolutely. And, I think we're seeing, you know, I think if we're focused to move into genre makes sense. Horror's having, and genre films are having a really cool moment now. And again, as I mentioned earlier, Neon and A24 are leading this space. Neon now has Possessor coming out, or it's been released, which has gotten all kinds of buzz. A24 has Saint Maud in their pocket, which has come out overseas, which come out in the UK this week or last week.
Mm-hmm.
And I think for a lot of labels, these sort of horror films, it's a bit of an easier sell for them than a traditional art house film. You can cut an easy trailer to it. The budgets are usually low, and to turn a profit, it's if they get the mix of marketing and reviews right, it's fairly easy to make that money back. So I think it's really two sides of the same coin. They can support an upcoming filmmaker, but they also have something that can be successful without a lot of effort on their part, especially if the film is really good.
Yeah, the demise of the costume drama is upon us, and those are really good points that you brought up. We conclude with Jacques Audiard, who is filming in the 13th district in Paris. I actually did some work to try to figure out where that is exactly, but it's a project that we discussed already. Let's look at the cast, which is top-lined by a relatively new face, her acting debut in Lucia Zhang, but also the other actors on board.
Yeah, it's an interesting array of actresses, really. As you mentioned, it's Lucia Zhang making her debut. Noémie Merlan, who, as we all know, had a huge year with Portrait of a Lady on Fire. And for the indie rock folks, and a bit of a surprising casting, is Jenny Beth, who is the lead singer of the band Savages. She also just put out a solo record this year, and a book, I believe, a book of erotic short stories. So it's a really eclectic cast. It's, I think we generally know Jacques Audiard for working with big names for his last few films.
Mm-hmm.
But it's really interesting. He's actually working with, some rising talent instead for this one. So it looks like a big gear shift for Audiard, but one that's also quite exciting.
We had mentioned last week that he co-wrote this with two female filmmakers, namely Céline Sciamma. So for Céline Sciamma, it's sort of like she's reteaming here with Merlan. Obviously, she knows the qualities and everything that this actress has to give. She was in Jumbo, a Sundance film this year. And also part of the cast is an actor named Makita Samba, who was in a film by an Austrian filmmaker, I believe, who did Angelo. And this takes place in the 13th district, a place where culture exists, and it's really, it's become like I believe there's a university there. So it's sort of like a cultural, young, youthful hub. So I can imagine something that's much more swift, that's where the pacing might be closer to Dépend, perhaps. But I feel as if we're going to see Jacques Audiard shifting gears here, and something that's perhaps more energetic.
That's a great point. I mean, the other interesting element here is the cinematography is being done by Paul Guillaume, and it will actually only be his second feature as his second feature film as a cinematographer. He worked with the co-screenwriter Léa Mysus on her film Ava from 2017. But it also marks, again, another change for Audiard, someone new to work with. So it sounds like he's really creatively reinvigorated, or creatively challenging himself. So, the film's in production now. I think the letters to Terry Fremo is probably already sending emails and gift bags and whatever he needs to do to the producers. So I'm very excited for this one. I think it's a bit of a sleeper, film Twitter talking about it, but I think they will be in probably 5 or 6 months.
Yeah, thanks for mentioning the cinematographer, because he did an excellent job in Ava, which, again, Léa Mysus is actually one of the co-screenwriters for this project. So both scribes are bringing on their talent, and yeah, it feels like a fresh new page for a filmmaker who tends to look at the underdog and people that are sort of like pushed aside in society. And here we're just going to get, I feel, a very vibrant set of stories that intertwine. And I think you made some good points about the fabric of this in last week's edition. So there's a lot of things to look forward to in this project. So definitely something to look out for in 2021. And that concludes another episode of IndieSponge. Thank you, everybody, for joining us. Thank you, Kevin.
Thanks a lot. Always a pleasure.
See you next week. Thanks.
I'm Eric Lavallée. I'm editor-in-chief and site owner for IONCINEMA.com. And this is
Kevin Jagernauth, contributing writer for the playlist.
And together we are IndieSponge.